At dawn, federal soldiers found 19 armed men dead inside the ruins of the Black Reed grain mill. A 20th body lay beyond identification. Every iron door was still locked. Outside, a 63-year-old black woman sat alone with a ledger against her chest. When they asked how 20 night riders had been sealed inside, Seraphine Celestine gave them the only answer that mattered. The locks had remembered what they were built to do. The Black Reed grain mill burned through the final hours of the night on October 17, 1874. By sunrise, the roof had collapsed. The upper floors were gone. Smoke continued to rise from broken machinery and scorched grain. The east wall remained standing, held together by brick, iron, and the weight of a history local authorities had spent years trying to erase. Federal soldiers entered through a section of wall that had split under the heat. They did not enter through the doors. The doors would not open. The main courtyard gate was locked from within the masonry. The lower storage entrance had been secured by 3 recessed bolts. The stairwell door had warped in the fire, but its locking bar remained fixed inside the stone. Men with axes struck the frames. Blacksmiths brought hammers. Nothing moved until sections of brick were removed around the iron. Inside, the soldiers found weapons, masks, lengths of rope, and broken containers that still smelled of lamp oil. They also found bodies. 19 were eventually connected to prominent white families in Black Reed Parish. 1 had served as a deputy. 2 owned agricultural warehouses. 3 had worked directly for former plantation families. Several were registered members of local political clubs that publicly denied any connection to night violence. The 20th body could not be identified at the scene. Local officials tried to control the facts before the smoke cleared. Sheriff's deputies described the dead men as citizens responding to a disturbance. They called the masks protective cloth. They called the rope ordinary equipment. They called the oil a tool for lighting the building. They did not explain why 20 armed men had entered a black-owned mill after midnight. They did not explain why every worker had been absent. They did not explain the iron tags found inside a forced-open chest, each engraved with the legal name of one of the attackers. And they did not explain the woman sitting outside. Seraphine Celestine was 63 years old. She had been born enslaved on the Delacroix sugar plantation and had spent most of her life repairing machines she was never permitted to own. When the soldiers found her, she was seated on a low section of stone approximately 30 yards from the mill. Soot covered her dress. 2 fingers on her left hand were permanently bent and shortened. She held a leather-bound ledger against her chest with both arms. She did not attempt to flee. She did not claim the fire had been an accident. She did not ask what had happened inside. A local deputy approached first. He ordered her to surrender the book. Seraphine refused. The deputy reached for it. A federal officer stopped him and demanded that the ledger be entered into evidence before local authorities could remove it. That decision would later expose a network of judges, landowners, merchants, and lawmen involved in organized racial terror across several Louisiana parishes. But on that morning, nobody outside Seraphine understood what the ledger contained. They were more interested in the doors. The Black Reed Mill had been constructed before the Civil War to process grain for 3 plantations. Its owners claimed the heavy iron architecture was necessary to protect valuable stores from theft and humidity. Plantation records told a different story. The building contained reinforced chambers without exterior windows. Several doors could be locked from concealed passages. Old accounting books referred to food issued to confined labor in the lower rooms. Punishment logs recorded men and women being held there after escape attempts, work stoppages, and accusations of theft. The mill had not only processed grain, it had processed fear. The locks were designed by Seraphine's father, Mamadou Sarr. Mamadou had been taken from the Senegambia region of West Africa. Before his capture, he had trained in ironwork and mechanical construction. In Louisiana, plantation owners recognized his ability and turned it into property. He was ordered to repair tools, build restraints, and construct locks for warehouses and confinement rooms. The system treated his knowledge as an asset while treating the man himself as merchandise. This was not admiration for African craftsmanship. It was extraction. The same people who denied Mamadou's humanity depended on his intelligence. At Black Reed, he was forced to combine methods he had learned before enslavement with French-warded locks, Spanish bolt systems, and plantation-built counterweights. The final design was unusually complex. Its strength did not depend on one visible keyhole. The real mechanism sat behind the wall. A surface lock controlled the handle. A second iron tumbler controlled a recessed bar. A third mechanism, hidden inside the masonry, could engage multiple doors from a maintenance corridor. The owners believed this would make escape impossible. Mamadou made one alteration they did not detect. He created a second operating sequence. It was not marked on any plan. It required no conventional key. Pressure applied at specific points could release or engage the internal tumblers in a precise order. The sequence could be identified by sound: a short scrape, a dull drop, then a narrow metallic click. To the plantation owners, those noises meant nothing. To Mamadou, they formed a language. He taught that language to Seraphine after she reached adulthood. The lessons were brief. They took place while machinery covered their voices. Mamadou showed her how to identify a damaged bolt by vibration. He taught her how heat changed iron, how dust slowed a tumbler, and how a lock could be controlled from the side that appeared powerless. He did not teach her because he expected justice. He taught her because captivity depends on controlling knowledge. The plantation controlled the building, the tools, the written plans, and the legal system. Mamadou preserved the one thing they could not fully seize: the method inside his mind. Years later, 6 enslaved people disappeared from the Delacroix property. The confinement room had been opened without visible damage. No key was missing. The outer lock remained intact. The plantation owner concluded that Mamadou had used the concealed sequence. He was questioned, beaten, and publicly executed. No formal court record survives. The plantation ledger reduced the killing to a labor adjustment. Mamadou's name was removed from the following month's ration list. That was how the system recorded murder when the victim was legally owned. Seraphine was then ordered to repair the same lock her father had opened. She refused. The overseer placed her left hand on a workbench and crushed the ends of 2 fingers beneath an iron tool. The injury was meant to destroy her ability to handle fine mechanisms. It was also meant to demonstrate that technical knowledge belonged to the plantation, not to the person carrying it. The punishment failed. Seraphine completed the repair with her remaining fingers. More importantly, she memorized the entire mechanism while doing it. For the next 3 decades, she said almost nothing about the hidden sequence. Owners changed. Machinery was replaced. The Civil War ended legal slavery. The mill passed through debt, abandonment, and tax seizure. The locks remained. By 1874, the building belonged to a cooperative formed by 37 black families. The structure that had once confined enslaved workers now processed their grain and protected their land records. Seraphine maintained the machinery. She also maintained the concealed bolts. Local white officials regarded the cooperative as an economic threat and a political insult. Black farmers no longer had to surrender most of their crop to former plantation owners. They could earn money independently. They could acquire property. They could finance voter registration. That made the mill a target. After the fire, investigators questioned Seraphine inside the parish courthouse. The room contained 3 local officials and 1 federal examiner. The officials asked who had helped her. They assumed a black woman of her age could not have controlled the building alone. She told them nobody had helped her close the doors. They asked where she had obtained the keys. She told them there were no keys. They asked when she had converted the mill into a trap. Seraphine looked at the men across the table. She said the trap had been built before she was free. That answer was treated as evasion. It was not. The iron system had been created to hold black prisoners while armed white men controlled the exits. On the night of the fire, only the positions had changed. The law would later call this transformation murder. It would not call the original design a crime. Freedom did not return the land, the tools, or the years stolen from the people of Black Reed. It removed the legal word that had defined ownership of human beings. The men who had benefited from that ownership remained in place. They still controlled credit, courts, warehouses, roads, and armed patrols. They expected the formerly enslaved to return as indebted laborers, working the same fields under contracts written by the same families. The Black Reed Cooperative disrupted that arrangement. 37 black families pooled what little money they had. Some sold livestock. Others surrendered tools, jewelry, or the first profitable harvest they had ever controlled. They purchased the abandoned mill at a parish tax auction while former planters assumed the building was too damaged to matter. They were wrong. Within 6 months, the water wheel was moving again. Seraphine repaired the grain lift, rebuilt 2 broken drive shafts, and removed rust from machinery that had not operated since the war. She worked without ceremony. The same damaged fingers that plantation authorities had tried to make useless now adjusted gears, fitted pins, and restored the mill's iron systems. Her grandson, Nicanor Celestin, handled the forge. At 34, he was broad-shouldered, disciplined, and less patient than Seraphine. He sharpened plow blades during the day and attended political meetings at night. Farmers brought him split axles, broken chains, and damaged tools. He often accepted grain when they had no cash. The cooperative did more than process crops. It reduced dependence. Before Black Reed reopened, black farmers had been forced to take their harvests to white-owned mills. Fees changed without warning. Grain disappeared during weighing. Accounts were altered. A farmer might deliver 10 sacks and be paid for 7. Complaints led nowhere because the mill owner, merchant, and local magistrate often belonged to the same family network. At Black Reed, weights were measured openly. Payments were recorded in front of witnesses. The effect was immediate. Families retained more of their harvest. Debts fell. Several tenants purchased small plots. Others stopped buying supplies from former plantation stores. What appeared to be a modest industrial operation became a direct threat to the local system of control. Economic independence carried political consequences. Men who could feed their families without asking permission were harder to intimidate at the ballot box. Nicanor understood this. He began traveling between farms to help formerly enslaved men register to vote. He explained poll locations, read notices aloud, and accompanied those who feared arrest on fabricated charges. His work was legal. That did not make it safe. Sheriff Abner Creel first confronted him outside the parish courthouse. Creel had served in the Confederate Army before returning to Black Reed with a damaged leg and an undamaged sense of entitlement. He wore his badge as proof that defeat had changed nothing essential. Deputies followed his orders. Judges accepted his reports. Landowners paid men he claimed not to know. Nicanor arrived at the courthouse with 6 prospective voters. Creel blocked the entrance. He said the registration office had closed. Nicanor pointed to the posted hours. The office was required to remain open for another 2 hours. Creel looked at the men behind him. They can return another day. Nicanor did not move. The confrontation lasted less than a minute, but several witnesses remembered its silence. Creel was accustomed to fear appearing before he had to make a direct threat. Nicanor gave him none. A federal registrar eventually opened the door. All 6 men entered. That night, one of their houses was burned. No arrest was made. The pattern continued across Black Reed Parish. A farmer registered to vote and lost his barn. A teacher organized a political meeting and was beaten on the road. A church announced a public gathering and found the doors marked with oil. Creel classified each incident as a private dispute or accident. Drusilda Fenwick began recording what the sheriff refused to investigate. She was 46, precise and difficult to intimidate. Before emancipation, she had been forced to manage household accounts for a family that denied she could read whenever outsiders were present. After the war, she became the cooperative's clerk. Drusilda listened to survivors. She noted dates, locations, and names. She compared stories from different settlements and identified repeated participants. Men who appeared in one attack were seen near another. Wagons used during night raids belonged to known landowners. Ammunition found after shootings matched supplies ordered through specific merchants. But paper alone did not stop violence. The cooperative began changing its routines. Workers traveled in groups. Grain deliveries were moved to daylight. Meetings ended before dark. A warning bell was installed near the loading platform. Nicanor repaired an old signal horn and placed it inside the freedmen's church. Seraphine watched these preparations without objecting, but she understood their limitation. A warning could tell people violence was coming. It could not force the law to punish those responsible. Creel increased the pressure. Deputies stopped wagons bound for the mill and inspected them for stolen goods. Farmers were detained until their grain spoiled in the heat. Merchants were warned that doing business with the cooperative might invite fire or arrest. Then the mill's water channel was blocked. Seraphine found the obstruction before dawn. Timber and stones had been driven into the channel upstream, reducing the current enough to stop the wheel. Nicanor wanted to confront the landowner whose property bordered the channel. Seraphine told him to clear it first. They worked waist-deep in cold water for 3 hours. When the final timber was removed, the wheel turned again. Only then did Nicanor ride to the landowner's house. Creel was waiting on the porch. The sheriff did not deny responsibility. He did not need to. He told Nicanor that machines failed, buildings burned, men disappeared in swamps. Nicanor answered that threats sounded different when recorded. Creel smiled. "You think writing a name makes it dangerous?" Nicanor looked at the badge pinned to Creel's coat. "No. Men make names dangerous by what they do." From that day forward, Creel stopped treating him as a nuisance. He treated him as a target. Nicanor continued organizing. He also began leaving Black Reed for longer periods. Sometimes he returned after midnight. On other occasions, he was absent for several days and gave no explanation. Drusilda questioned him once. He told her he was learning how Creel's men moved after dark. She warned him that observation could become exposure. Nicanor said exposure was the point. Seraphine noticed changes he did not discuss. Mud from roads north of the parish. A torn cuff repaired with thread used by white merchants. A small burn on his wrist that did not come from the forge. She asked where he had been. He said he was doing what the law would not. She told him that men who entered a hidden organization rarely controlled the terms of their exit. Nicanor did not answer. 3 months before the mill fire, he failed to return home. His horse was found near the edge of the swamp, reins caught in low brush. One stirrup had been cut. Blood marked the saddle and the sleeve of a coat lying near the water. Search parties entered the cypress ground. They found broken reeds, several boot prints, and a place where something heavy appeared to have been dragged toward deeper water. They found no body. Creel sent 2 deputies to observe the search. Neither entered the swamp. By evening, the parish had already accepted a familiar conclusion. Nicanor Celestine had challenged the wrong men, and Black Reed would receive no official explanation. Drusilda closed the mill office and covered her type ledger. Workers gathered outside in silence. One man asked when the funeral would be held. Seraphine stood beside Nicanor's empty forge. The fire had gone cold. His hammer remained on the anvil where he had left it. She examined the blood-stained coat. Then she turned the sleeve inside out. The fabric had been cut before the blood reached it. The stain had soaked across an edge that should have remained protected if the coat had been worn. Seraphine folded it carefully. "There will be no funeral," she said. The others assumed grief had made her refuse the evidence. It had not. She had seen enough violence to recognize death. She had also spent a lifetime studying mechanisms designed to deceive the eye. Something about Nicanor's disappearance had been constructed. The question was whether he had constructed it himself, or whether Abner Creel wanted Seraphine to believe he had. For 9 weeks after Nicanor disappeared, Black Reed remained open. The mill processed grain, repaired tools, and paid farmers on schedule. Seraphine refused to let fear close the building for Creel. She also changed the way it operated. No one worked alone after sunset. The rear loading gate remained barred during business hours. Every wagon was recorded before entering the yard. Seraphine inspected the water channel each morning and the iron doors each night. She did not announce these precautions, Public alarm would have weakened the cooperative and exposed the families who depended on it. Creel was waiting for panic. Seraphine gave him routine. Behind that routine, the threat continued to narrow. Masked riders appeared on the roads leading from the mill. They did not attack. They allowed themselves to be seen. A torch was left burning near the cooperative's boundary fence. Dead livestock was placed beside a black farmer's gate. Men who sold grain through Black Reed received unsigned notices ordering them to withdraw. The purpose was not secrecy. It was preparation. Creel wanted the community to understand that violence was coming and that no authority intended to stop it. The warning that mattered arrived through a postal worker named Orrin Vale. Vale was a white veteran with no political influence and no history of protecting black residents. His usefulness came from being ignored. Men spoke freely around him because they considered him too ordinary to matter. 2 nights before the attack, Vale entered the mill after closing. He did not remove his coat. He did not sit. He told Drusilda that Creel had gathered men inside a warehouse near the river road. He had heard references to lamp oil, the lower records room, and an operation to be completed before the parish election. Drusilda asked how many. Vale answered that 20 horses had been prepared. Seraphine stood near the flour scale, listening. She asked one question. Which night? Tomorrow. Vale left through the eastern field rather than the road. The warning forced an immediate decision. The cooperative could request federal protection, but the nearest detachment was several hours away. A telegram would pass through officials loyal to Creel. By the time soldiers arrived, the mill would be ash and the attackers gone. Armed defense was equally dangerous. A gunfight inside the settlement would give Creel the justification he wanted. He would call it a rebellion. Deputies would arrest the survivors. Newspapers would describe the attackers as citizens restoring order. The black families defending their property would become the accused. Seraphine rejected both options. She ordered Drusilda to move the residents. The evacuation began before dawn. Farmers were told that the water wheel required emergency repair. Workers removed personal tools and left in small groups to avoid attention. Families nearest the mill relocated to the Freedman's Church beyond the eastern ridge. No lamps were carried on the road. No bell was rung. By midday, the building appeared occupied from a distance. Grain sacks remained stacked near the windows. A maintenance coat hung beside the loading platform. Smoke rose from the forge because Seraphine kept a small fire burning. Inside, the mill was empty except for Seraphine and Drusilda. The evidence had to be divided. Drusilda removed the original land deeds, voter lists, and sworn testimonies from the office. She wrapped them in waxed cloth and placed them inside 2 flour barrels with false bottoms. The barrels left the property on a wagon carrying damaged grain. A second set of records remained behind. These were copies, incomplete ledgers, and blank forms arranged to suggest urgency. They were placed near the office desk where intruders would see them quickly. The central bait was prepared below. An iron chest stood in the basement beneath the weighing room. It had once held payroll money for plantation overseers. The chest was heavy enough to require several men to move, and strong enough to encourage the belief that something valuable was inside. Drusilda asked what they should place in it. Seraphine did not answer immediately. She went to Nicanor's forge and took a length of flat iron from beneath the workbench. For several hours, she cut it into 20 narrow pieces. On each piece, she engraved a name: Abner Creel, Deputy Silas Mott, Gideon Vanne, Perry Holt, Ephraim Lusk. The list continued until every expected rider had been identified. Some names came from Drusilla's records, others came from witnesses. Several had never been publicly connected to the masked raids. That was the point. The men entering Black Reed believed hoods protected them. Seraphine intended to destroy that belief before she touched them. The 20 tags were placed inside the chest. Nothing else. Drusilda watched her close the lid. You knew all of them? I knew enough. Drusilda understood what the chest would do. It would not physically stop the attackers. It would tell them they had been observed, named, and anticipated. Panic would begin before the first man understood the mechanism around him. That afternoon, Drusilda left for the church with the final documents. Seraphine remained behind. She refused armed volunteers. She refused Nicanor's old pistol. She carried no blade. Her weapon was already built into the walls. The mill contained 4 major exits and 3 internal barriers. The courtyard doors used twin horizontal bolts recessed into brick. The rear loading gate was held by a suspended iron bar controlled through a chain inside the maintenance corridor. The basement stairwell used a counterweight that could drop the locking beam into place. The upper grain passage could be sealed with a rotating shaft connected to the main wall. None of these systems could be operated quickly by an unfamiliar person. The plantation owners had designed them to prevent escape, not to permit emergency release. Mamadou's hidden sequence made remote control possible. Seraphine began with the courtyard mechanism. She removed years of compacted dust from the tumbler housing. She tested the movement once, then returned it to the open position. At the loading gate, she shortened the chain by 2 links. This ensured that when the bar fell, it would settle fully into both wall brackets. She checked the basement counterweight and found the rope had weakened. She replaced it. At the stairwell, she filed a corroded edge that might have stopped the bolt halfway. Every adjustment had one purpose. The doors must close silently and remain closed under force. She also inspected the emergency release. The lever stood behind a narrow brick panel in the maintenance passage. Pulling it would disengage the main locking systems at once. It was the only part of the design Seraphine could not alter. The lever could open every major exit. It could not open one. This limitation had been acceptable to the men who commissioned the mill. They had never imagined needing to rescue a specific prisoner. Their system recognized only 2 conditions: confinement or release. Seraphine tested the lever and reset it. By sunset, the mill was ready. She extinguished most of the lamps but left 3 visible from outside. She placed an open account book on the office desk. A half-filled cup remained beside it. The building looked abandoned in haste. After dark, Drusilda returned once through the rear field. She reported that the church was secured and that the families had arrived. She asked Seraphine to leave with her. Seraphine declined. Someone had to operate the mechanisms. The old locks could not distinguish intention. They required a hand, pressure, and timing. Drusilda studied her face. If they enter, what happens? They do not leave armed. That was all Seraphine said. Drusilda departed before 10. The first riders appeared near midnight. Seraphine saw lantern light moving between the trees. Then came the muted sound of hooves on wet ground. 20 men approached in 2 groups. They wore dark coats and cloth hoods. Several carried rifles across their saddles. Others held containers of oil. Rope hung from one rider's pommel. 2 men brought iron bars for forcing doors. Creel rode near the center, not the front. Men who direct terror often place bodies between themselves and resistance. The riders stopped outside the yard. One man examined the windows. Another tested the gate. It had been left unlatched. They entered without firing. Inside the mill, Seraphine stood behind the maintenance wall with one hand resting on the first control rod. The riders spread through the ground floor. Boots crossed the office. Furniture was overturned. One man called out that the records were missing. Creel ordered them downward toward the basement chest. More men entered. Seraphine counted the footfalls. 17, 18, 19. The final rider hesitated at the threshold. He turned once toward the road, then stepped inside. 20. Seraphine pressed the iron rod forward. Behind the last man, deep inside the courtyard wall, the first concealed bolt began to move. The first bolt entered the wall bracket without a visible movement at the door. Only Seraphine heard it. The sound traveled through the maintenance passage as a low iron knock. She kept her hand on the rod until the mechanism settled. Then she moved to the second control. The riders were already spreading through the mill. 4 searched the office. 3 moved toward the grain bins. Others descended toward the basement, following Creel's order to find the iron chest. Their boots struck different levels of the building, masking the movement inside the walls. Seraphine waited until the rear group crossed the loading floor. She released the suspended bar. The chain moved through its guide. The bar dropped behind the rear gate and locked into 2 stone brackets. It was too heavy to lift from the yard side and almost impossible to reach from within the mill. No rider reacted. The third mechanism controlled the basement stairwell. Seraphine rotated a short iron wheel until the counterweight shifted. A concealed beam descended across the upper frame after the final men passed beneath it. The mill was not yet fully closed. She left one internal route open. The attackers needed to reach the chest. Creel entered the weighing room with 6 men. He removed his hood because he no longer expected witnesses. The others followed his example. Their confidence depended on the belief that the building had already surrendered. They found the basement door unlocked. One man laughed. Creel told him to save his breath and move. The stairs were narrow. The men descended in single file, carrying 1 lantern and 2 rifles. Dry grain dust lifted around their boots. At the bottom stood the old payroll chest, fixed against the wall beneath a set of dead machinery. The lock resisted the first crowbar. The second attempt bent the outer plate. Creel ordered 2 men to use both bars at once. Above them, Seraphine closed the stairwell beam. The iron settled across the doorframe. The men below did not hear it over the sound of metal striking metal. The chest opened on the 5th attempt. The lid rose. There were no deeds inside, no voter lists, no money, only 20 pieces of flat iron. For several seconds, nobody moved. Creel took the first tag from the chest. His own name had been cut into it. The lettering was deep and deliberate. Abner Creel. Another man reached inside and found his name. Then another. Within moments, the tags had been spread across the floor. Men who had arrived masked now stood beneath the mill reading proof that their identities were already known. The discovery changed the room. Until then, they had believed themselves to be the hunters. The chest showed that someone had counted them before they arrived, predicted who would come and prepared a place for each name. One rider accused the postal worker. Another blamed a deputy. A third demanded to know who had spoken. Creel ordered silence, but his authority had already weakened. Terror works best when its agents believe they are invisible. The tags removed that protection without firing a shot. A man named Perry Holt ran toward the stairs. He reached the upper door and pushed. It did not move. He struck it with his shoulder. The beam held. Holt called down that the exit was blocked. Creel climbed the stairs and tested it himself. He first assumed the wood had swollen. Then he found the surface lock still open. The door was secured by something deeper. He ordered a rifle brought up. The first shot destroyed part of the latch plate. The door remained closed. The second shot entered the brick beside the frame. Dust fell from the wall. The concealed beam did not shift. Creel understood that they were not facing an ordinary lock. He ordered the men back to the ground floor through a storage passage on the opposite side of the basement. That route had been left open intentionally. Seraphine heard them moving. She crossed the maintenance corridor and reached the upper grain passage before they emerged. The internal shaft required both hands. Her damaged fingers could not grip the old handle firmly, so she used her forearm and body weight to turn it. The mechanism resisted. She forced it another quarter rotation. A long bolt moved through the wall. The upper passage closed just after the final rider crossed into the grinding chamber. All 20 men were now inside the central structure. The 4 major exits were secured. Creel tested each one in sequence. The courtyard door refused to move. The rear gate could not be lifted. The stairwell was blocked. The upper passage had sealed behind them. He sent men to search for another way out. They broke open storage rooms and entered abandoned work areas. They found narrow windows fitted with iron frames. They found old ventilation shafts too small for a man. They found doors that opened into rooms with no exterior exit. The mill had been designed to control movement. Under slavery, that design had served the plantation owners. Men and women could be separated, confined, and moved without understanding the structure around them. The building gave power to whoever controlled the hidden mechanisms. On this night, Creel controlled nothing. The riders began tearing into the walls. They used crowbars against brick and rifle stocks against wooden panels. One group tried to remove hinges from the courtyard door, only to discover that the hinges had been mounted on the opposite side and reinforced with iron straps. Another man climbed into the grain lift and attempted to reach the roof. Seraphine engaged the brake. The platform stopped between floors. The man climbed back down before the lift could trap him. She did not need to confront them directly. The mill had already divided their strength. Every failed escape increased fear. Every blocked passage forced them deeper into the building. Creel began searching for the operator. He knew someone was moving inside the walls. He ordered men to listen for footsteps. They heard only machinery settling, water striking the wheel outside, and the intermittent movement of iron. One rider fired into a section of wall after hearing a scrape. The bullet passed through plaster and struck a gear housing several feet from Seraphine. She did not retreat. She changed position before they fired again. Creel found the maintenance entrance near the office, but the panel had been secured from within. He drove a blade into the seam and tried to widen it. The old wood cracked. Behind it was a layer of brick. Mamadou had designed the passage to remain invisible even when the surface was damaged. The plantation owners had feared sabotage from enslaved workers. Their precautions now protected Seraphine from the men who had inherited their authority. The riders regrouped in the grinding chamber. Their masks had been discarded. Sweat and grain dust covered their faces. Several continued holding rifles, but the weapons had become nearly useless. There was no visible enemy to shoot. Creel placed men at each exit and ordered the others to search the floor for trapdoors. No trapdoor existed. The only release stood in the maintenance corridor behind Seraphine. She reached it and placed her hand on the lever. The mechanism could disengage the courtyard bolts, lift the loading bar, and release the internal beams. It had been built for overseers who might need to empty the confinement rooms quickly. It was crude by design. One movement opened everything. There was no selective release. Seraphine examined the linkage once more. Nothing had changed in the decades since Mamadou showed it to her. The mill recognized no difference between one prisoner and 20. From the grinding chamber, Creel shouted that he knew she was inside the walls. He called her by name. He ordered her to open the doors. Seraphine remained silent. Creel offered money first, then protection, then immunity. When she did not respond, he changed tactics. He threatened the families at the church. He said the mill would burn, and that anyone found nearby would be blamed for the deaths. The threat revealed his next decision before he issued it. One of the riders objected. Fire inside a grain mill was unpredictable. Dust could carry flame through the upper floors before they reached an exit. Creel dismissed the warning. He still believed violence would restore control. He ordered 2 men to bring the lamp oil from the lower room. The containers were placed near the grain sacks. A torch was lit. Inside the maintenance passage, Seraphine kept one hand on the release lever. She could end the confinement immediately. Outside, less than a mile away, the Freedmen's Church held the families Creel had already threatened. Inside, 20 armed men waited for the door to open. Creel raised the torch and announced that the first flame would force her to choose. He did not understand that the choice had already been built into the mill decades earlier. Release everyone, or release no one. Creel did not throw the torch himself. He handed it to Deputy Silas Mott. That decision mattered later, when local officials tried to describe the fire as an act committed by Seraphine. The men inside had brought the oil. They had prepared the flame. They had chosen the room where it would be used. Mott hesitated. The grain sacks were dry. Dust coated the floorboards, beams and exposed gears. Any man who had worked near a mill understood the danger. Fire did not remain where it was placed. In a confined structure, fine grain particles could carry ignition through the air. Creel repeated the order. Mott pressed the torch against the corner of a sack. The fabric darkened first. Then it burned. A narrow flame moved upward through the fibers and reached the loose grain scattered across the floor. Another man poured oil beside it, believing a larger fire would frighten the hidden operator into releasing the doors. The flame crossed the oil in seconds. Seraphine heard the change before she saw it. The small crackle became a low rush. Heat entered the maintenance passage through gaps in the brick. Smoke followed, thin at first, then heavy enough to settle against the ceiling. She kept her hand near the release lever. She did not pull it. Inside the grinding chamber, Creel ordered the men to stand back and wait. He expected Seraphine to panic. He expected age, isolation, and fear to defeat the discipline that had carried her through slavery, punishment, and war. The first minute passed. No door opened. Motte stamped at the burning sack, but the oil had spread beneath it. Another rider overturned a barrel of water. The contents were insufficient and carried burning material farther across the floor. The fire reached a wooden support. Above them, accumulated grain dust lifted in the rising heat. The ignition moved across the ceiling as a sudden band of light. Men dropped to the floor. A pressure wave struck the walls, blew out interior glass, and extinguished one lantern. It was not enough to destroy the building, but it changed the fire from a threat into an uncontrolled event. Creel no longer commanded the room. The riders rushed toward different exits. Several collided at the courtyard doors. One man struck the iron with a crowbar while another tried to force the ruined surface lock. A third fired into the frame despite warnings that the bullet might return from the metal. At the rear gate, 4 men attempted to lift the suspended bar. They could not reach its full length. The locking points were embedded inside the stone. The stairwell filled with smoke. Men who had entered black homes at night and depended on confusion now faced confusion without an unarmed family to dominate. Their methods offered no protection when turned inward. Threats could not move iron. A rifle could not intimidate a wall. Creel regained enough control to divide them into groups. He ordered one group to fight the fire. Another was sent to break through the eastern wall. A third searched for Seraphine. The orders contradicted one another. Every man pulled away from a task to escape the growing heat. Seraphine moved through the maintenance corridor toward the water wheel controls. The mill's pump system had once supplied small amounts of water to cool machinery. It was not designed for firefighting, but she opened the valve anyway. A weak stream entered the lower channel. It slowed the flame near the machinery but could not reach the sacks. She had not prepared the mill to burn. Her plan had been confinement, disarmament, and exposure. She intended to hold the riders until federal soldiers or armed residents arrived in daylight. Creel's fire had changed the terms. Now the building itself was becoming unstable. The old timber supports had survived decades of moisture and neglect. Heat began opening cracks along their length. Iron gears expanded. Chains tightened. The locking mechanisms remained engaged, but the structure around them was under pressure. Seraphine placed her palm against the brick beside the courtyard linkage. The vibration was uneven. The bolts were holding. From inside, Creel shouted her name again. This time he abandoned offers of money. He promised that every black-owned farm in the parish would burn if she survived. He named men at the church. He named Drusilda. He claimed riders were already waiting outside the settlement. Seraphine knew he was likely lying. She also knew the threat described exactly what he would do if released. A man near Creel began pleading for the doors to be opened. Another told him to stop speaking to her. A third accused Creel of leading them into a prepared trap. Creel struck the man with the side of his pistol. The group turned on itself. Their unity had always depended on secrecy and advantage. Once both were removed, loyalty became accusation. One rider attempted to surrender. He approached the maintenance wall, placed his rifle on the floor, and called out that he had not taken part in previous raids. Another man immediately identified him as a participant in the burning of a schoolhouse. The accusation was followed by another. Names, locations, and crimes began emerging from the men themselves. Seraphine listened from behind the brick. The fire was forcing confessions no court in Black Reed Parish had ever demanded. One admitted driving the wagon used during an assault near Bayou St. Clair. Another said Creel had ordered the destruction of voter registration papers. A merchant accused a deputy of keeping money taken from a murdered farmer. They were not seeking truth. They were trying to redirect punishment. But the result was the same. The organization that had protected itself through silence was exposing its own structure under pressure. Seraphine could not preserve every statement. There was no witness beside her and no time to record names. She retained what she could. A beam fell in the grinding chamber. The collapse separated 5 men from Creel's group. Smoke thickened. Those nearest the floor could still breathe, but visibility was disappearing. Creel ordered them to fire into the ceiling to create an opening. The shots damaged roofing boards but did not create an escape route. Burning debris fell into the room. At the eastern wall, men succeeded in removing several bricks. Behind them, they found the outer iron support that reinforced the mill's frame. Mamadou's work remained intact, the same hidden architecture that plantation owners had commissioned to prevent enslaved prisoners from escaping now resisted men who had inherited the plantation's violence. There was no moral intelligence inside the locks. Iron did not distinguish victim from attacker. That responsibility belonged entirely to the hand controlling the release. Seraphine returned to the emergency lever. Smoke had entered the corridor. She wrapped cloth across her mouth and tested the linkage. It still moved. One pull would open the main courtyard bolts and release the rear gate. The men would have several possible routes out. Some were injured. Some had discarded their weapons. Most remained armed. Beyond the mill, the road led east toward the church. Seraphine calculated the distance. A rider on foot could reach the families within minutes. Several horses remained outside. If Creel escaped, he could regroup before federal authorities knew anything had happened. The choice was no longer between fire and safety. There was no safe outcome left. She could open the doors and risk a massacre outside, or keep them closed and leave every man inside to the consequences of the fire they had started. Creel reached the wall closest to the lever. His voice came through clearly. He said that if she opened the doors, he would declare the attack a misunderstanding. He would say the men entered because they believed the mill had been abandoned. He would protect her from prosecution. Seraphine had heard similar promises under slavery. Cooperation was always offered after resistance became costly. Protection meant silence. Mercy meant returning power to the person who had abused it. She did not answer. Creel began counting. At 10, he said he would order the church burned. At 20, part of the upper floor collapsed. At 30, his voice disappeared beneath shouting and the grinding failure of a drive shaft. Seraphine tightened her grip on the lever. Then another voice reached her. It did not come from Creel's position. It came from the grain sampling slot near the lower corridor, a narrow opening used to inspect the quality of stored grain. Someone was striking the metal cover from inside. 3 measured knocks. A pause. Then 2 more. The rhythm was familiar. Nicanor had used it at the forge when machinery made speech impossible. Seraphine moved toward the slot. A hand appeared through the opening. The sleeve was dark, burned at the cuff and marked with the same merchant's thread she had once found on Nicanor's clothing. The man behind the wall struggled to breathe. He did not call for the mechanic. He did not call her by name. He spoke one word. Grandmother. Seraphine removed the metal cover from the sampling slot. Smoke moved through the opening before she saw the face behind it. The man had pulled off his hood. Soot covered his skin. One side of his coat had been torn, and the cuff carried the same pale merchant's thread Seraphine had noticed months earlier. It was Nicanor. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The fire had already removed the time for disbelief. A support beam cracked above the grinding chamber. Men shouted from the lower floor. The mill's central shaft continued, turning unevenly as heat distorted its fittings. Seraphine reached toward the emergency lever. Nicanor stopped her. Not yet. His voice was weak but controlled. The explanation came in fragments because smoke had made sustained speech difficult. Nicanor had not been taken near the swamp. He had arranged the disappearance himself. The blood on the coat had come from an animal slaughtered outside the parish. The cut stirrup, the disturbed reeds, and the drag marks had been placed to create a convincing scene. He knew Creel's men watched the roads and questioned anyone connected to the cooperative. A simple departure would have exposed his purpose. A death would end their suspicion. He had spent 3 months inside Creel's organization under another name. The men had accepted him because he supplied information that appeared useful but caused no immediate damage. He identified abandoned cabins as possible meeting places. He reported false movement along river roads. He claimed resentment toward Black Reed and said Nicanor Celestin had received praise while other men remained invisible. Creel did not require proof of hatred. He required obedience. That was the weakness Nicanor exploited. The organization operated through separate cells. Most riders knew only the men assigned to their own raids. Creel controlled the full structure. Orders passed through deputies, warehouse owners, and political clubs that publicly described themselves as civic associations. Nicanor learned where they met. He learned which merchants supplied fuel. He learned which judge dismissed charges before arrests were made. He learned that black farmers were not being attacked at random. Properties were selected in advance. Men with desirable land were marked for removal. Their debts were purchased by Creel's allies. Violence cleared the way for legal seizure. The raids were not uncontrolled rage. They were an economic system. Nicanor had searched for evidence connecting the masked riders to the officials who protected them. Testimony could be denied. Witnesses could disappear. A hood found after an attack proved nothing by itself. Creel kept the proof in a ledger. Every initiated member signed an oath using his legal name. Payments, assignments, and planned operations were recorded beside coded marks. The ledger listed attacks across multiple parishes and identified public officials who received advance notice. Nicanor had seen it only twice. On the night of the Black Reed raid, Creel brought it with him. He intended to compare names in Drusilla's records against the organization's own intelligence. After destroying the mill, he planned to remove several members whose identities might already have been exposed. Nicanor joined the raid to steal the ledger before Creel burned it. He had expected confusion. He had not expected Seraphine to close the building. Through the narrow slot, Nicanor pushed a leather-bound book into the maintenance passage. Seraphine caught it before it fell. The cover was dark with soot. A brass clasp held it shut. Creel's initials had been pressed into the leather. This was the book she would later hold outside the ruins. At that moment, it was not yet evidence. It was the reason every man inside would kill to reach the door. Seraphine secured the ledger beneath her coat and returned to the release mechanism. Nicanor placed his hand through the slot and gripped her wrist. If she opened the doors, Creel would search her first. He would recover the ledger. Then he would ride to the church. The attack on Black Reed had never been limited to the mill. Creel had prepared a second action in case the cooperative resisted. Riders from another district were waiting for a signal. If the mill fire became visible and Creel failed to appear, they would assume the evidence had been moved to the church. Nicanor did not know whether those men had already started toward it. He knew only that releasing Creel would give them a commander. Seraphine examined the slot. It was too narrow for Nicanor's shoulders. She moved toward the nearest linkage and attempted to disengage the lower passage separately. The iron rod would not shift. The fire had expanded the surrounding metal, tightening the mechanism. She struck the retaining pin with a wrench. Nothing moved. Mamadou's design had never included an individual release. The locks had been commissioned by men who viewed prisoners as a group. They required efficient confinement, not discrimination. One lever opened the system. One sequence closed it. The mechanism could not recognize that one man behind the doors had entered to expose the others. It could not recognize blood, loyalty, or sacrifice. That burden remained with Seraphine. She tried the basement counterweight. The chain had drawn rigid under heat. Even if she cut it, the locking beam would fall deeper into place. Nicanor told her to stop. Creel had heard their voices. He moved toward the other side of the wall, coughing and striking the brick with the grip of his pistol. He demanded to know who was speaking. Nicanor replaced the metal cover over the slot, but the concealment had already failed. Creel called his false name first. Then he used the real one. The organization had discovered the infiltration. Creel's reaction confirmed what Nicanor had said. He did not express surprise that a man believed dead was inside the mill. He accused Nicanor of theft and ordered the others to seize him. The riders turned toward the sampling corridor. Nicanor moved away from the opening. A struggle followed beyond the wall. Seraphine could not see it. She heard men striking wood, a rifle falling and Creel ordering Nicanor kept alive until the ledger was recovered. Then Creel addressed her directly. He offered an exchange. Open the courtyard doors. Return the book. Nicanor would be allowed to leave. The offer was presented as mercy. It contained none. Creel had spent years treating law as a costume placed over force. His bargains operated the same way. Agreement did not bind him. It only required the other person to surrender first. Nicanor returned to the slot under guard. Creel forced him close enough to speak. Seraphine could hear several men behind him. Creel repeated the terms. Nicanor answered before she could. He ordered them to kill me at the river. Creel struck the wall beside the opening and told him to remain silent. Nicanor continued. The night before the raid, he had overheard Creel instructing Deputy Mott to dispose of him after the records were recovered. Creel had become suspicious of conflicting reports. Nicanor had entered the mill knowing he might not leave, but he believed the ledger could be taken during the confusion. Now the ledger was outside Creel's reach. That was the only advantage left. Creel threatened to shoot Nicanor. Seraphine knew he would not do it immediately. Nicanor remained leverage. Creel needed her hand on the lever more than he needed revenge. The fire moved into the upper machinery. A gear housing broke loose and struck the floor. The impact shook dust and embers from the beams. Men inside began shouting that the roof was failing. Creel abandoned negotiation. He ordered Seraphine to decide whether her grandson lived. This was how men like Creel understood power. They created the danger, selected the victim, and then accused another person of causing the consequence. Seraphine placed both hands on the release lever. Nicanor spoke through the slot. He told her what would happen if the doors opened. The 19 riders still had rifles. Several were injured, but none had surrendered his weapon completely. Their horses waited in the yard. The road to the church was clear. They would not flee the parish. They would finish the raid. Nicanor told her that Mamadou had preserved the locking sequence to help people escape confinement. He knew what the decision would mean to her. The knowledge had passed through 3 generations as an instrument of release. Now its final use might be refusal. Seraphine asked whether another exit existed near him. Nicanor said no. She asked whether the wall could be broken from his side. He said they had already tried. A section of the upper floor collapsed. The sound cut through the conversation. Creel and several men retreated toward the courtyard doors. Nicanor remained near the slot. His next words were calm. "Keep them from the church." Seraphine did not answer. She removed her hands from the lever. On the other side of the wall, Creel understood the decision before anyone announced it. He began shouting threats again, but they had lost their purpose. He no longer controlled what Seraphine feared most. She had accepted it. Nicanor placed one hand through the slot. Seraphine held it with her damaged fingers. There was no final speech, no promise that sacrifice would correct the world. Black Reed had already demonstrated that evidence could survive while justice failed, and that courage could protect a community without protecting the person who showed it. Nicanor withdrew his hand. Seraphine closed the metal cover. She took the ledger and moved toward the outer end of the maintenance corridor as the roof supports began to give way. Behind her, the emergency lever remained upright. Every lock stayed engaged. Seraphine left the maintenance corridor through a service opening concealed behind the eastern foundation. She emerged into wet grass as the upper roof failed. The collapse sent sparks across the yard and forced the waiting horses into panic. Several broke their reins and ran toward the road. Others remained tied near the fence, pulling against posts while smoke covered the mill. Seraphine did not approach them. She moved away from the wall and sat behind a low section of stone with Creel's ledger beneath her coat. Inside, the shouting weakened. The fire continued until dawn. When the first federal soldiers arrived, the mill had become a burned shell. The courtyard doors remained closed. The loading gate was still secured. Sections of wall had collapsed inward, but Mamadou's iron bolts had not released. The soldiers found Seraphine alone. She gave them no account of Nicanor. Not yet. She understood that Creel's allies would arrive quickly, and that any truth spoken before the ledger was protected could disappear with the book. A parish deputy reached her first and demanded possession of it. Seraphine held it tighter. The deputy accused her of stealing official property. He could not explain why a private oath ledger belonging to masked riders should be considered official. A federal lieutenant intervened and ordered the book sealed as evidence. That decision prevented the first attempt to destroy the case. The second began before the bodies had been removed. Local officials claimed the dead men had gone to the mill after seeing suspicious lights. They said the men entered to protect property. They described the rope, masks, and oil as ordinary equipment carried for travel and emergency use. Their story required the public to ignore the hour, the weapons, and the engraved name tags. It also required them to ignore Abner Creel. The sheriff's body was identified near the courtyard doors. His pistol remained in his hand. Beside him lay a broken container of lamp oil and one of the iron tags bearing his name. Deputies removed the tag before federal investigators could photograph its position. They were too late to remove the others. All 20 names were recorded. The 20th body required more time. The remains carried no visible identification. Heat had destroyed most of the clothing, but a damaged metal clasp survived near the torso. Seraphine recognized it as part of Nicanor's work belt. She did not react in front of the officials. Later, Drusilda identified the clasp. That was the first time the community learned Nicanor had died inside the mill. It was also the first time they understood that his disappearance had not been a murder at the swamp. Questions followed immediately. Why had he entered with Creel? Why had he worn a hood? Why had Seraphine not released him? The ledger answered the first two questions. The third would never receive an answer that satisfied everyone. Federal investigators opened the book under guard. Inside were legal names, payments, meeting locations, and coded assignments. Entries connected landowners to attacks on black farmers. Merchants had supplied fuel and ammunition. Deputies had redirected patrols away from planned raids. A judge had received advance notice before witnesses disappeared. Nicanor's assumed name appeared near the final pages. Beside it, Creel had written a short instruction. Remove after Black Reed. The meaning was clear. Nicanor had been marked for death before the mill doors closed. The ledger also contained a list of properties scheduled for seizure after their occupants were driven away. Several belonged to families sheltering in the church that night. The attack had not been an isolated act of racial terror. It was part of a land operation. Violence cleared the property. Debt completed the theft. Courts made the result appear legal. The evidence triggered arrests beyond Black Reed Parish. 2 deputies fled the state. A warehouse owner attempted to burn his account books. A magistrate resigned before federal officers reached his home. Some defendants were charged. Several were acquitted. Others avoided trial through political connections. The network was damaged, not destroyed. Still, the cooperative survived. The land deeds Drusilda had removed from the mill were accepted by federal authorities. Attempts to seize the farms were suspended. Families who had expected eviction completed the harvest on property registered in their own names. That outcome was later cited as proof that justice had prevailed. It had not. Justice would have required the law to protect Black Reed before 20 armed men entered the mill. Justice would have required Creel to face trial while alive. Justice would have recognized Nicanor as an infiltrator who exposed organized violence. Instead, the state prosecuted Seraphine. She was charged with 19 counts of murder and 1 count relating to Nicanor's death. The men who entered with masks, rifles, rope, and oil were presented as victims of a prepared machine. The prosecution avoided the origin of the locks. Jurors were not told in full that the mill's reinforced rooms had once confined enslaved workers. References to Mamadou's execution were dismissed as irrelevant. The court treated slavery as a closed period, with no bearing on the mechanism, the property, or the men who controlled the parish after emancipation. The fire was discussed as though it began without an author. Seraphine testified only once. She stated that Creel's men entered the cooperative illegally. She stated that they brought the oil. She stated that they ignited the grain sacks. She admitted closing the doors. The prosecutor asked why she had not opened them once the fire began. Seraphine answered that the men were armed, and that the road to the church was unguarded. He asked whether she knew Nicanor was inside. She said she learned it after the fire had already spread. He asked whether she could have saved him. She looked toward the jury. "I could have opened the doors," she said. "I could not open only his." That distinction was the entire case. The court refused to understand it. An all-white jury convicted her. The sentence was imprisonment for the remainder of her life. Newspapers described the verdict as restoration of order. None printed the names of the black families whose land had been targeted. Few mentioned the planned attack on the church. Nicanor was described as a participant rather than an infiltrator. Official language completed what the fire had not. It attempted to erase motive. Seraphine lived 2 more years in the parish jail. Drusilda visited when permitted. During the final winter, Seraphine gave her a set of handwritten pages describing the black reed mechanisms. The drawings showed the recessed bolts, counterweights, and secondary tumblers. They documented Mamadou's methods with enough accuracy to preserve his work. One section was missing. Without it, the system could be studied but not rebuilt in full. Drusilda asked whether Seraphine had forgotten the sequence. Seraphine said no. She had removed it deliberately. Knowledge had protected black reed once. The same knowledge had previously helped plantation owners imprison people. Seraphine refused to leave a complete weapon for another jailer, sheriff, or landowner to inherit. Her final written statement contained no request for forgiveness. It contained a warning. A lock does not know justice. It does not know who owns the building, who entered with a weapon, or who is trapped by mistake. It obeys design, pressure, and the hand placed upon it. The moral responsibility belongs to the person who decides when it opens. Seraphine died in custody in 1876. The cooperative declined to rebuild the mill. Workers cleared the dangerous machinery but preserved one exterior wall and the warped courtyard door. The locking mechanism eventually rusted apart. Years later, the door stood open because it was no longer capable of closing. 2 names were fixed to the remaining iron. Mamadou Sarr, who had been forced to build the locks. Nicanor Celestine, who had chosen not to have them opened. Seraphine's name was added later, not by the court, by the families who kept their land. Subscribe for more stories hidden beneath official records and protected by silence. Then comment your city, state, or country below, and tell us your theory. Did Seraphine deliver justice, choose revenge, or make the only decision Creel had left available to her? Black Reed preserved the evidence. The judgment still belongs to those willing to confront it.